Welcome back, class. We're diving right back into chapter 14, which has to do with third-party rights. So far, we've covered mostly the issues between two parties. Offer, acceptance, we've pretty much been doing those in two. But most agreements in real life involve third parties in some way. Now we're gonna get three-dimensional with contracts. So now we're 3D. Same concepts, but now we're applying them to more than two parties. So one concept you have to understand here is assignment. Okay, so that's if you're a party to a contract and you can assign your rights or your duties to other parties. And there's three types of those that are outlined in the first part of the chapter. One is assignees. Okay, those are outsiders who get rights after a contract is made. The second is delegatees, and those are outsiders who get duties after a contract is made. The last is third-party beneficiaries, and those are outsiders who get rights when the contract is made. Now, the general concept is this chart here, this table, on page 461, and you've got an obligor who owes a duty to an obligee, and then an obligee can assign those rights to an assignee. That's what happens here. Now, the obligor is the one who owes the duty. So I don't know if it's helpful, but I think of an obligor as sort of this person who lives under a bridge, and they are like a character from a sort of a fable or something, and they're an obligor, and it's a rough lifestyle for them, and they owe a duty to the obligee. Now the obligee can assign those rights, the duties performed by the obligor, to an assignee, and that's generally going to be legal. We want to, in our free economy, in our promotion of entrepreneurship in the United States, we want to be able to let business people assign rights, assign duties of another to an assignee, to a third party. Now the assignment is legal unless it would A, materially change the obligation of the obligor, B, materially burden the obligor, C, increase the obligor's risk, or D, diminish the value of the contract. It would also be legal unless a statute prohibits it, okay? So we'll go into that. Or if the contract itself precludes or prevents it from happening the way it's written. Now the assignment method, we've got how it happens, the manifestation of it. It's when it happens. The UCC, it has to be in writing. We talked about the UCC requiring writing if contracts are more than $5,000. Similarly, an assignment, if it's over $5,000. And generally, it's revocable if there's no consideration. Okay, so we're going to learn a case at the end of the chapter about how there has to be some consideration when that's happened. Consideration means acceptance. So if something's offered in exchange, that generally means acceptance, or if it's in writing. And the notice element is practical, but it's not required. So if an assignment happens while the obligor doesn't have to get notice, it can be an excuse for the obligor not to make a payment, for example. So let's say in real life, a mortgage, it gets transferred from one bank to another bank. The contract is valid. The new bank has the right to the payments from the homeowner in accordance with the mortgage, but if the homeowner doesn't make the payments, that would be an excuse. I mean, how would they know that the contract was assigned, that the mortgage was assigned, if the new bank doesn't give notice? So while it's not required for it to manifest, it's practical if you want to get your money and you're the second bank, if you're the assignee in that case. All right, the effect of an assignment is generally that you, as the assignee, are able to stand in the shoes of the assignor, the obligee who sold you or somehow assigned you the the rights of the contract. And there's exceptions to that, like the sale of a negotiable interest, but that's business law 2, that's in chapter 23. Or if there's a waiver. So for example, someone is an assigned creditor, but the horse dies. You know, we talked about earlier that the destruction of the subject material of a contract would generally void that contract. And I mentioned earlier when they're not allowed, for example, you know, material change in the duties of an obligor. So if someone's required, the example in the book, someone's required to, under a contract, to cut someone's lawn in exchange for maybe living in an apartment or something. If it's a certain size lawn, you can't assign that duty to someone who has a much larger lawn, for example, because that materially changes the performance, the duties. So the obligor would take on much larger lawn. If someone assigned that, that's not going to be allowed. So someone would have to get some type of more consideration or something for that. It's generally not allowed. We talked about, okay, assignment of personal rights. So for example, if a student agrees to do research work with a particular professor, that professor can't assign that student to another professor because that student was making the deal to work with that particular professor. Or a 65-year-old driver is going to have maybe cheaper insurance than a 17-year-old. So a grandpa can't give his insurance to a 17-year-old because by the nature of insurance, we talked about the element of risk being different. So, you know, an insurance company is going to assess risk for a 17-year-old to be much higher than grandpa, the 65-year-old. That's an example in the book. All right, assignments that are forbidden by statute or public policy, for example, wages, for example. You know, we have a rule in New York State that garnishment of wages can max out at 10%. So, you know, if you have a judgment and you're collecting it against someone as a business person, you can garnish their wages, but there's a limit to that at 10%. And something like that is going to have limits as far as enforceability. There's contracts that prohibit assignment. Now that's against public policy. I told you earlier in the case that generally we want to support entrepreneurship, and part of that is being able to assign contracts. But sometimes there can be contracts that prohibit it. It can be within the contract. And if it's reasonable, then it's going to be enforceable. Future contracts, that's okay sometimes. So the example in the book is Ben gets $20 per shoveling, but he needs $80 now to get a new printer, for example. So, you know, he can generally get sort of a loan for that and do the shoveling later. Partial assignments, separation ability is required, but all parties are subject to dispute. And successive assignments, the first assignee has the precedence, except where it's ineffective or revocable. Assigner's warranties, a signer has legal responsibility in making assignments. So if Ben assigns Robinson's $50 debt to a friend and he discharges Robinson, then he's going to owe that friend $50 because, you know, he has a duty to warranty the performance of that contract, or else he's out the $50 himself. Delegation of duties, the basic rule or the general rule is that duties are delegable as well. The UCC allows that as implied, and most common law requires it to be express. So that's one of those differences between common law and the UCC. And again, the UCC, the purpose of that is that we have a you know, certain baseline agreements in all the 50 states. And then again, there's an international version. But when it comes to duties, those are delegable. So we want to be able to say that, you know, as in the spirit of entrepreneurship, if someone can perform a job cheaper, we would have that person be allowed to, we'd have the business person be allowed to hire somewhat cheaper or to provide those duties at a cheaper rate. All right, non-delegable duties, personal services. So I talked about being able to assign labor. We generally want that, but if it's a personal service, like a famous singer, if you contract with a famous singer to perform, they can't just send their understudy, for example. And then there's delegations that are barred by contract. Again, it's generally disfavored. But if it's a personal thing, then that would be understandable that someone wouldn't allow a substitute to take the place of someone. Third party beneficiaries. General rule, non-parties lack standing except intended third parties. So, if someone is a third party beneficiary, they generally cannot sue the person who's supposed to give them if they're unintended. If the person who's on the other side of the contract doesn't know that there's a third party beneficiary when they make the contract, then that third party doesn't have standing. Now, there's generally two types. We've got a creditor, and that's generally enforceable because it's just money. Money is a universal thing. I mean, there's really not a difference between one particular dollar and another. I mean, people collect coins, and old coins can be novel, and that would be an exception. But generally, money's universal, and it can be doesn't matter whose money it is. A donee. So I won't test about a lot of this language, just that obligor and obligee, who that is, and then the assignee. So the obligor is the person who owes the duty. Think of that fable creature under the bridge. The obligor, they're sort of got a rough life and they got to take care of that bridge. That's how I think of it, and maybe it'll help you on the test. Let's see. So an example here for a donee is in the book here. We've got Abel. Abel contracts with a woodsman to cut the timber on his property, and as a Christmas present to the neighbor, the neighbor's going to have a nice view of the lake, let's say, because the trees now aren't in the way. So if the woodsman doesn't go and cut the timber down in time for Christmas, the woodsman would owe both a duty for the timber for Abel, but if it's known to the woodsman why, the secondary reason why the trees are to be cut, which is so the neighbor can have a view of the lake, if the woodsman knows that, then the woodsman is liable to both parties. But if he only thinks that he's cutting down the trees for wood for the benefit of Abel, then he wouldn't be liable to the neighbor for that secondary benefit. Government contracts, when it involves government contracts, so the government will put out a bid and contractors will bid on that. So they'll put out an offer to bid, and then contractors will bid on an offer. And generally the public are incidental beneficiaries. So for example, if the government was wanted to build a bridge, and they put an offer out for contractors who build bridges, bridge builders, and the bridge builder fails to build a bridge by the summer, and maybe you're in Ithaca here and you're counting on the tourists coming in, and you have a restaurant right at the end of that bridge, you can't sue the contractor because generally under government contracts, the general public are incidental beneficiaries. That's the example in the book. All right, the cases at the end of the chapter, we're talking about Nassau Hotel Company versus Barnett and Barst Corporation. That's a case from New York State in 1914. And you had a hotel where the owners of Nassau Hotel, I assume that's Long Island, Nassau County, they contract with Barnett and Barst to manage their hotel. And the deal is that the owners will still retain 19% of the gross income, or $50,000 liquidated damages. Okay, and liquidated damages, I think we discussed liquidation. That's the concept of turning a sort of a deal into a money amount, liquidating it. So think of a liquidation sale. You know, a furniture store is going out of business. They want to liquidate their assets. They want to sell it off at whatever cash they can get. So they're liquidating. Or if there's a divorce and the parties have assets, they liquidate those assets. Or if someone has an estate and they die, they liquidate the estate often and split the money between the beneficiaries. So liquidation. So the concept here of liquidated damages is you build in to a contract that if someone doesn't perform, there's going to be liquidated damages. In class, I talked about maybe a Santa suit. So if you contract to build a Santa suit, you're one of these mall Santas, and you need a Santa suit. You need it by Black Friday. You need it by Thanksgiving, the day after. That's when people are going to be out shopping when we were allowed to be around each other. Anyways. Well, the time between Black Friday and Christmas, that's when the mall Santa is going to earn all their money. So if the Santa suit comes out after Christmas, well, it's virtually no good. You know, you need it by Black Friday. So you build into the contract, well, I'm going to lose $1,000 a day if I don't have the suit. And that's liquidated damages. So it's a concept, but you can put a figure on it. So the hotel company did that in that case. And the court ruled that the defendants, Barnett and Barst, were particular people and they couldn't be substituted. So they couldn't assign the duties to manage the hotel in that case. All right, assignment includes delegation. We've got Rose versus Vulcan Materials. That's North Carolina, 1973. And the plaintiffs in that case, the Rose family, sold their quarry or their rock pit, their mining pit, to J.E. Dooley & Son. And as part of the contract, Dooley & Son was supposed to be able to give a lower price to the Rose family for their minerals when they would come get it, a lower price that compared to the market was lower than the market price. So then they sold it to a third party, and that third party, Vulcan Material Company, refused to honor that lower price. And the lower court said they didn't have to, but it was reversed on appeal. And the Rose family, they were, as a third party as a original contract party, the Vulcan Material Company who took over, they had to honor that original covenant, that part of the contract when they were assigned the contract, because that was a duty under the contract. All right, third party beneficiaries and foreseeable damages. This is the case of Kornblit versus Chevron Oil Company. That's another case from New York in 1978. And we had the New York State Thruway had a contract with Chevron Oil Company to respond to distressed motorists on the thruway within, I think it was 30 minutes or an hour. And in this case, the family was on the side of the road. It was 92 degrees, and the father was trying to change his tire. And after 3 hours of doing that, he had a heart attack and died. So a jury awarded a wrongful death settlement to the family because Chevron Oil Company had this contract where it wasn't just them in New York State. There were these third-party beneficiaries. And the court ruled in that case that a distressed motorist who dies because they're late under the contract, that's not a foreseeable damage of the contract. So the third-party beneficiaries in that case were limited on what they could recover, not wrongful death. All right, that's the end of chapter 14. We'll see you in chapter 15.